Welcome again to Educator.com as we learn how to eat this elephant together. The next part of the elephant we're going to eat is writing introductions. So, we're going to go over the basic structure of the essay just one more time. We got the introduction paragraph, we got 3 body paragraphs, and the closing paragraph. This lesson is concentrating on number 1 right here. I'll show you what the point of an introduction paragraph is and how to make it so that your reader's going to want to read everything else. So, first off, we got to get that reader interested with the introduction paragraph. I mean, if it's not a good introduction, why should they read the other 4 paragraphs if they don't like the introduction? They'll get bored and just want to read something else. Also, the introduction paragraph is important because you got to mention that topic, then you also have to mention the thesis. And which comes first? Well, the topic's the most broad, the thesis is a little bit more tight, so we're going to mention the topic first. But above all, your introduction must clearly state the thesis. It has to be so clear. It's got to be like the sun on a California afternoon. That is how clear that thesis has to be in the introduction. We usually put it at the end, but there's a bunch of things that we put to lead up to the thesis first. So, the first thing that we want in our introductions is we want a great opening line. And I'm going to go over a couple possibilities that you can use for your first opening line to really grab the reader's attention and make them want to read on. Remember, the introduction is all about getting the reader's attention, and so we got to appeal to emotions to do that. First thing we're going to do is quotations. So, a quotation has a certain type of emotional appeal. It appeals to someone's sense of admiration. It also associates your paper with a really, really awesome person. And it also will add credibility to whatever else you're going to say next. Where can we find these great quotes? Well, we got books by authors. That's probably about the most obvious place. Famous speeches are a great place to look for quotes, if you got the patience to read through them all the way. I bet that you got lots of songs memorized right now. So I bet you could come up with some great song lyrics, and appropriate ones that might be good in the beginning of your essay. And then, of course, there are hundreds and hundreds of websites there that will have quotes for you. Be careful about these websites. I read one that was supposed to be attributed to Plato a while back, and it turns out it was actually just from a 19th century minister. So be careful about those websites. Kind of check them out. Make sure you can fact check them before you put them in your essays. Here's an example of a fairly long quotation that I might start a paper off with. Anybody can become angry. That is easy, but to be angry with the right person and to the right degree and at the right time and for the right purpose and in the right way, that is not within everybody's power and is not easy. A fellow by the name of Aristotle said that. He wrote books over 1,000 years ago and people are still reading him. Does Aristotle sound like he has some important stuff to say? He definitely does. What do you think this paper's about? Can you guess? What have I referred to over and over again in this quote? What am I going to write about? Do you know my thesis yet? No, but you do have an idea of the topic, don't you? Here's another great quotation. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, and those who are cold and are not clothed. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Okay, who is Dwight D. Eisenhower? Why was he famous? Do you know? Maybe you can look him up on, Wikipedia or something, or Google him. But he's he was a popular president. But a lot of people still really like him, even though he was a president back in the 50s. How does this quote make you feel? I just read a nice long quote about guns, warships, and really awesome things. And also hungry people who are not fed and cold people who don't have clothing. What do you think this essay is going to be about? What do you think? What's my topic? Here's another great one. Music is everybody's possession. It's only publishers who think that people own it. Okay, that comes from a fellow named John Lennon. Now, who's he? Well, if you don't know who he is, maybe you can ask your parents. They might be able to tell you. Now, what's my topic? What am I talking about here? Am I talking about publishers or music in general? Talking about music in general. And why should people believe John Lennon, a really famous and prolific musician, on the matter of music? Well, I've already answered that question for you. And what do you think this essay is going to be about? Well, it's going to be about music. You don't know my thesis yet, but I have at least got you the topic so that when you're reading my essay, you'll understand that the thesis is going to be talking about music somehow. So, when you find quotations, you got to find a quotation that's relevant to the topic somehow. I mean, I'm not going to quote John Lennon on, the problem of anger and how we should be angry. And I'm probably not going to quote Aristotle on, a famous essay about world history because, well, he might have lived before the history I'm about to talk about. Make that quote fairly short and to the point. It doesn't have to be as long as the Aristotle one. Sometimes the shortest are the best. After all, we are the Twitter generation, and everybody just kind of tweets their quotes. And if it's short, it's going to sound great, and it'll probably be easy to remember, and it'll stick in the reader's mind, and they'll want to keep reading. Now, who do you quote? Well, you got to quote famous, accomplished people. I mean, you could quote, your dad, and that'd be kind of fun. But does anybody other than you know your dad? Well, I mean, unless you're the son of or daughter of somebody really famous, maybe you just shouldn't quote your parents. You also got to quote somebody who has some credibility on the subject. And what I mean by credibility is, should people believe this person? Okay, John Lennon has credibility with music, doesn't he? Well, because he was a really famous musician. Dwight D. Eisenhower has credibility on the subject of war. Well, because he was a general and he fought one. But maybe I'm not going to quote Dwight Eisenhower on, intellectual things like philosophy or literature. And maybe I'm not going to quote John Lennon when it comes to the subject of nuclear physics. Probably not the best people to quote if they don't know anything about the subject that I'm writing about. Also, and this last one is super important, if you know your reader, if you know who's going to read this, you want to quote people you already know that they like. So think about this. If you're writing for maybe your history instructor, and you know your history instructor already thinks that Dwight Eisenhower is the greatest president in the history of the United States, quote Dwight Eisenhower. Maybe he doesn't like Dwight Eisenhower, though. Maybe he thinks FDR was a great president and really likes FDR, or Thomas Jefferson, or anybody else. Well, if you find that out and you pay attention to your teacher's lectures, you should quote the people that they like, because they'll not only like your paper more, but because they like it, they'll give you a better grade. So, now that we've gone over quotations, let's go over to rhetorical question. What is a rhetorical question? That's what a rhetorical question is. A rhetorical question is a question that a reader or speaker asks and doesn't expect the audience to answer. However, you will answer it for them. So, I may answer the question later if I'm speaking, but I never expect the audience to answer it out loud, of course. Rhetorical questions kind of generate a little bit of mystery and a little bit of thought in the reader's mind that makes them want to read on so that they'll get an answer to that question that you've asked. Here's an example. Who is Severus Snape, and why does he resent Harry so much? So what's the emotional appeal here? Well, I've appealed to mystery if you don't know anything about Severus Snape, but this idea of resentment, that's a powerful, powerful emotional word. And I put it in my rhetorical question to get the reader's attention. Can you guess what the topic is here? Resentment? Harry? Well, it's not a what, it's a who. You bet that I'm talking about Severus Snape if I mention this rhetorical question. And why should the reader keep reading on? Why should they bother? Well, I bet they want to know an answer to why does Severus Snape resent Harry so much? Here's another great rhetorical question. Which is more important, making a great movie or selling a lot of movie tickets? What's the emotional appeal on this one? Well, we all want to see great movies, don't we? Yeah, we like movies. And we want to see great movies. We don't want to see boring movies. We want to see movies that are works of art, don't we? Well, turns out that maybe the best movies, the greatest movies, the ones that are really worth watching, maybe aren't the ones that sell a lot of tickets. Now, what's a topic here? Well, am I talking about movies or movie tickets? I'm probably talking about movies. And I bet that you have an opinion on this matter. If you've ever gone to the movies, paid, $8 or $10 or $12 or $15 for a movie that you heard was really good, and it was really disappointing, and you left that theater frustrated and wanting your money back, you really, really like movies, and you want to see great ones. So I bet you have an opinion on this question right here. Here's another great rhetorical question, and I've divided this into 2 sentences. Humans love animals as pets. Why do we eat them for food? What's a topic? Animals? Eating animals as food? You kind of decide. It's not just animals in general, but you can kind of guess what I'm going to talk about here. What's the author's opinion? Now, I'm not a vegetarian, but imagine if somebody had written this. What do you think the author's opinion on this matter is? And how do you feel when you hear this? Right now, I bet that you are feeling a problem of consistency in your own mind. I bet when I read this, humans love animals as pets. You thought, yes, I love my cat, I love my dog, I love my hamster, I love my parrot, I love my monkey. I bet you really thought, yes, I love my pet. Then I said, why do you eat animals for food? Okay, that creates a problem of consistency. You love some animals but not others. And if somebody has created a problem of consistency in your mind, or if you do it in the audience's mind, they're not only going to feel an emotion, but they're going to want to keep on reading, if for no other reason to resolve that problem that you've created in their minds. Next great thing is jokes and humor. So, humor and jokes. Well, what's the emotional appeal of something that's funny? Well, it's funny. You make the reader laugh. You make the reader chuckle. They like you. They like your paper. They'll keep reading on. And humor almost always goes into 2 things. It always goes to a sense of surprise or a feeling of superiority. Now, you want to be careful with humor for 2 reasons. First off, I'm here to tell you that humor writing is some of the hardest writing that anybody can do. If you think of all the famous comedians who stand up and do monologues on TV, or they're on, a news show that does a lot of jokes, or they're, on a sitcom, writing one joke and writing that many jokes in a minute can take a whole staff of writers. Humor writing is not easy. However, if you can think of some funny jokes, or maybe you can repeat some that you heard, that the reader will find funny and not offensive, it will help the reader like you. Now, when I said here that all writing goes down to a feeling of a surprise or a feeling of superiority, that basically means that people laugh at 2 things, when they're surprised or when they feel better than somebody else. Sounds terrible, but I want you to think carefully about all the things you laughed at, and I bet it was either one of those 2 things. Here are some examples of jokes for you. If you think education is expensive, you should try ignorance. Politicians are like diapers. They must be changed frequently and for the same reason. That flew by your head. Think carefully about it. Some people say I missed my high school reunion. I didn't miss anything at all. These are all examples of jokes using a little bit of surprise and superiority. If you laughed or even grinned at any one of these, it was one of those 2 feelings. I guarantee it. Irony and surprise. Irony and surprise are closely related, and it does a problem with that consistency issue that I mentioned earlier. We'll see how this works. Now, what is irony? Well, it's not an iron, and it's not pumping iron. Irony is when something is true, but you wouldn't really expect it to be true. Quick example is Charles Murray in that Wrinkle in Time book you've all been reading. He's 5 years old, who doesn't speak, but is super intelligent and can read minds. I wouldn't have expected that from a 5-year-old who doesn't say much. I wouldn't have expected him to be the kind of person that's just crazy smart and can read minds. Here's another example. Bill Gates dropped out of college. What? Bill Gates, the super rich guy, one of the richest guys and most successful people on the planet? He dropped out of college? You wouldn't expect that to be true, but it is true. Surprise is a little bit like irony, except that there's kind of a setup in one sentence and then the big irony and the big unexpected thing in the next sentence. Here's an example of surprise. Environmentalists refuse to buy things from oil companies. They prefer to live in tents made from oil and to heat their houses with it. I've just made a surprise. And have you noticed that I've kind of made a consistency problem here? Here are some more examples of irony and surprise. Thomas Jefferson was a passionate lover of liberty who fought for abolition. That means, let's get rid of all the slaves. Yet he owned hundreds of slaves at his own plantation. What? He wanted to free slaves, and then he also owned them. Surprise. Albus Dumbledore is a friendly, charming mentor to Harry, who has no problems about sending Harry to die. Irony and surprise. A little bit of a consistency thing. What's going on with Albus Dumbledore? Number 3. One of the greatest advocates for peace in the last century was a military general, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Irony, surprise. So what else can we do? We've kind of got our little bit of the opening lines out of the way. We got our quotations. We got our rhetorical questions, jokes, irony, and surprise. So what else can we put in our introductions to kind of get the reader's attention? Well, there is something called an anecdote. An anecdote is a short story or an illustration that connects to your topic. Now, what's the appeal of telling a story in your first paragraph? Well, one thing is mystery and curiosity. Kind of like rhetorical questions, you generate in the reader's mind a question that needs to be answered or a contradiction that needs to be resolved. Also, like humor, stories are fun. We like to have fun and we like to read stories, so we'll get attention if we tell stories. And finally, and this last one's a little hard to understand, is that most audiences identify with people, not things, and not ideas. So if I was to talk about the Great Pyramids of Egypt, well, that's a thing. But if I told you a story about maybe one of the pharaohs buried there, you might pay a little bit more attention. If I went to something abstract like democracy, communism, the republic, or things that, maybe we haven't really thought about, or psychology, or, any abstract subject, you might not connect with it right away. But if I told you a story about, Thomas Jefferson, or some great thinker, or I told you about Carl Jung, who was a psychologist, and I told you a compelling story about them, you might be interested in what they talked about. Here's an example of a very interesting anecdote. There was once a businessman who started a cake company. All his efforts and money turned into failure. But he recovered and started again. Once again, his business failed. It failed a third time as well. Then he changed the company name to Sara Lee. And I suppose you know the rest. Now what's interesting about this is you can probably see a 3-act structure. Can you see it? Well, maybe I haven't given you the climax, maybe I haven't given you the end, but you can kind of see what's going on here. Well, anecdotes have little 3-act structures too, just like larger stories. Here's another great one. For years, California migrant workers picked all kinds of fruit. They were paid below minimum wage, but could get no other jobs. One day, the bosses said that they could pay nothing at all because business turned bad. It was here that one worker said, "Enough is enough." That man was Cesar Chavez. Well, I haven't gotten you to Act 1, and I've told you the first doorway, but did I tell you the end of this story? No. Why not? Well, because that's what the rest of the essay is going to talk about, right? And I want you to feel like you need to know the end of this story. Doesn't always have to stop there. Here's another great anecdote. A violent explosion, of which the world had never seen, shook a New Mexico desert in July of 1945. Its explosion was so bright that scientists wore the darkest of sunglasses to prevent blindness. One scientist, Oppenheimer, proclaimed, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." This was a detonation of the first atomic bomb. Okay, I've given you a climax of the story. In fact, Big Explosion is about as climactic as you can possibly get. What do you want to know now? Is there anything that maybe I've piqued your curiosity with this story? Maybe you want to know a little bit more about Oppenheimer? How about this quote, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds"? Why did he say something like that? Well, I'll tell you about it in the rest of the essay. So let's kind of wrap up here. What's the purpose of that introduction paragraph? You got to get the reader's attention. And you do that by appealing to emotions, not logic. Have a great opening line. Irony, surprise, humor, good quotation. You got to introduce that topic and then your thesis. Make the reader feel like they should read on. And don't be afraid to use an anecdote if you can find one that's appropriate and great. For your assignment, please continue reading Wrinkle in Time, and please continue reading 12 to 13 of Brave New World. And read the introductions posted on the site. I've written a few. And how do they get your attention? Finally, I'd like you to write down one thing that's funny about one of your thesis topics. I'd also like you to write down a 3-sentence story about one of your theses or topics. Just 3 sentences. And then you can go to the internet, or if you can find a book, find a great quote that's about your topic. And why don't you write a rhetorical question about one of your topics too? And this will get you going on writing an introduction. Thanks for munching on the elephant with me, and thanks for using educator.com.